audacious webinar. And I'm going to do my best to faithfully represent some slides material that were largely put together by my colleague, Dr. Aaron Wilson. And he is the climate specialist for OSU Extension right now, and he's part of our State Climate Office of Ohio. And so really I'm speaking on behalf of SCU. What I wanted to draw your attention to is we have a presence on social media, but we have our webpage, and I would draw this to your attention so you could go and look at it afterwards. Our simple mission is to act as data stewards to connect Ohioans with weather and climate information necessary to improve lives. And I highlighted weather and climate because these are really interrelated in often subtle ways. And the state of climatology today is much revolutionized from what it was in the mid-20th century to see the dynamic coupling. But as a professor, I got to take the advantage to do a little bit of tutorial here about the difference between weather and climate. And so if I could draw your attention here to what weather looks like, here's a bunch of satellite images strung together for the entire year of 2013, showing you weather phenomena on our dynamic globe. We've got weather systems going across the mid-latitudes in our part of the world, drawn by the westerly winds. We can see the intertropical convergence zone around the equator with our convective puffy clouds popping up on a diurnal basis around these verdant tropical rainforests. And of course, the zoom around the Antarctic here of these storm systems. So this is a very dynamic system indeed, and weather is indeed very dynamic. It's the instantaneous state of the atmosphere, but it relates to the fundamental drivers of climate, which are basically energy from the sun that drives all weather and climate, and it's being received here on our spinning orb of Earth and sets up the dynamic pressure systems that drive our circulation systems of the dynamic fluids of the atmosphere and the oceans. Now, so we could say basically weather's the high frequency changes in temperature, wind speed, et cetera, caused by the imbalance of energy across the globe. But if we want to look at climate, we got to think about the long-term perspective. We got to assimilate all this weather information that we're experiencing on a day-to-day, moment-to-moment basis into longer-term averages and extremes over longer periods. So that when we think about climate trends, it's much more reasonable to think about an analogy that's been used. You may have seen this before. That's kind of like a man walking a dog. It doesn't have to be a man, it could be a woman. But in this case, you can see the cartoon and you can notice how the dog's going to be on the end of a leash, but he's going to be a walking nose, right? He can smell everything. Imagine what you'd be like if you could walk through life smelling like a dog. So he's going this way and that, up and down, okay? You can't really know exactly where he's going to be going except for the fact that he's on this tether, and you can notice that if you're going to predict the outcome, you would look at the course of the man or the woman walking. This would be the long-term projection of the instantaneous weather factors, that is the climate trend. Now, you don't know exactly where he's going to go, but you have a pretty good idea from where things are projecting. And that gives you a sense of the difference in this trend. So with that backdrop, I got to remind us, of course, that weather's therefore the lived experience of the atmosphere for us all. And Ohioans, we're no stranger to the powerful impact of weather. We could look back to a few major incidents of the 20th century, remembering the 1913 flood event, which came, this is the most deadly weather event that we've ever had. Over 460 lives were lost. With intense rainfall in the March period that did not have infiltration capacity and flooded. We could look to the 1978 blizzard, which was an extreme winter event that experienced the lowest pressure ever recorded around Cleveland, atmospheric pressure-wise. Extreme cold disrupted the state for 5 days, over 50 lives were lost. We could look to 2012 and the derecho wind event where Columbus, Ohio had over 80-mile-an-hour winds. This had about $3 billion worth of damage by the time this feature blew quickly through to the East Coast. Or even just last year, Memorial Day, we had over 15 tornado outbreaks in a single day, and one of which got to EF4 rating. So we're no stranger to the power of weather, and we know that it's costly. And in fact, if we look here, these are graphics showing the increasing costs of weather phenomena. These are billion-dollar weather events. And a couple things to note here. In the graphic in the upper right, you see a map of how weather phenomena and these billion-dollar weather extremes have differential characters depending on where they're experienced. But also, by and large, the costs are just going up and up. And we're seeing more and more of these events that are topping billion-dollar impacts. And if you look at Ohio, these are largely coming through hydrology. through rain and excess precipitation related events, so flash flooding, and then heavy rain events. So I want to use weather as a lens to consider the backdrop of climate and the variation that we're seeing of what climate change looks like in Ohio. And largely, it's exactly that. It's through this hydrologic cycle. We are blessed to be in the middle latitudes. We're pretty flat and low lying, and we have access to a lot of water. But as we shift the temperature regime to the atmosphere, we can hold more moisture in the atmosphere. So if we look just at 2019 and take a quick review through the weather phenomenon, we can see a year that ranked the 12th warmest in our record. Notice our observational record reliably goes back to 1895, so 125 years worth of record. And if we think about quantifying the long-term variance, we as climatologists like to use a thing called the normal period, which is a 30-year averaging, so multi-decadal. And you can see where the average temperatures of 2019 came in above average, as did the maximum temperatures and the minimum temperatures. This was a fairly warm year, and it was the 6th wettest at the same time. So we look at back the total span of record, and then we look at accumulated precipitation. We can see where we were well above. Here's our inches. Okay, this black map is quite blue. So above the 40-inch mark and into the 50-inch mark. This is percent departures above the normal, percentage of the mean. And you can see that we're in the 100 to 125%. So this was a wet, warm year. More than that, if we look at the character of the variation of weather, we could set ourselves up to review how the implications of this altered precipitation and temperature regime were felt. So if we go back to the fall of 2018, we can remember that we had a wacky and wet fall. I say wet and wacky because look at the precipitation totals. Here we have accumulated precipitation in percentage of the normal periods. These are in excess of 200% in those dark, lighter blues here. But think about the wackiness of the contrast in temperature between the departure here in September, which was above, well above the normal period average, to a transition to a very cold November. So a very highly variable temperature regime. And a lot of this was driven, if we look at the global interconnectedness of our climate patterns, by tropical activity. Nevertheless, if we look then to what happened during the winter, we continued to rank as a wet, warm year. And these are some values. So winter 2019 ranks 11th wettest on record for Ohio, with precipitation 150 to 200% above average, especially if you look where it's focused, south of the I-70 belt. And then if you look what happened in January, we then shifted into a very cold snap. And with all that saturated soils and frozen conditions, we had a lot of freeze thaw. And think about the impact to road infrastructure. Spring had the similar feature of rinse and repeat. March through May 2019 ranked as 36th warmest and 32nd wettest for the state. And what you see in this GIF evolving here is calculated soil moisture ranking percentiles through the months of 2019, and they're very green. Okay, we're in the accumulated, very moist conditions. So that means our soils are saturated. West, central, and northwestern Ohio, okay, ranked 7th and 3rd wettest on record, respectively. If we look at St. Mary's, Ohio, one observer in our citizen science cocoa rods, by the way, if you want to join this, please let me know afterwards, observing precipitation, 20 inches of precip between March 1st and May 31st. That's over half of the normal yearly total in just 3 months. Multiple other observers had excess of 15 inches. We had reports of 20 to 26 days of at least a trace of precip during the month of May. This all translates to a radical impact to an agricultural sector. Only 7 days were suitable for getting into the fields in May. So this was a wet year. And if you look at statewide precipitation ranks from June 2018 to May 2019, you see Ohio right there setting an all-time record. And you could divide that and aggregate it to divisions to see similar rankings. And we could look at other periods from July to June and August to July. This was a pretty darn wet year. But then what happened, if we look into the summer months, we went into a rapid transition to drought conditions. This was the drought monitor map for Ohio for October 22nd. And you can notice that large sections of the state were into D0 and D1. And that relates to, I have to take off my glasses to read the screen, abnormally dry to moderate drought conditions. Here you can see the state temperature ranks for a very record-setting warm September. So very quick transition into a hot atmosphere that dried the soil. Now that, again, problematic for ag. So 2020, if we look at the winter so far, here's average temperature departures from December to February, and then the accumulated precipitation, and both of these showing warm and moist conditions. And we're seeing this continue. So just to take a step back, okay, where does this fit within the 2019 year as a globe? Well, 2019 ranks as the second warmest that we've ever experienced on this planet since 1880. 9 out of the 10 top warmest, by the way, years on the global average, and this is mean conditions as a departure from the norm, so anomalies. 9 of the 10 warmest have occurred since 2005. And you can notice this GIF playing over here on the right side of your screen shows the NASA simulation of the pattern of which that warming anomalies are taking place. It's not warming at the same rate everywhere. You can see a higher latitude preference. Some interesting patterns across this, and that's the lesson too for these climate changes. We have to look regionally. But I'm not gonna, in this point of the lecture, put on my global climate change science hat and explain to you what's going on. I'm gonna take it on faith that we are on the same page as that intro video, okay? I'm gonna quote Professor Katherine Hayhoe. Climate change is real. It's caused by us, and it's serious. But there are solutions, and there is hope. What's happening as we load up the atmosphere with more greenhouse gases is we're enhancing this natural effect, which is actually essential for all life on the planet, by adding more greenhouse gases to enhance this warming effect and putting us in a condition that's really quite anomalous. When we look at where we are in parts per million carbon dioxide compared to the last 800,000 years of record and the proxy for temperature and direct measure of CO2 in ice core records, we can see how much we are out of the range of natural variability, and where we're headed could be extremely out of this range. So I'd like to just say, this is climate reality science, and we got to pay attention to what this means. When we think about the larger picture, there's a lot of evidence. In fact, the National Climate Assessment Report that came out this past year, the fourth assessment report, over the last century, there are no alternative explanations supported by the evidence that are either credible or that can contribute more than marginally to the observed patterns. In other words, when we look at all the evidence, there's really no other explanation than it's us, okay? And there's some critical feedbacks. If you want to learn more about how sea ice is going down, how mountain glaciers and ice caps are melting, you could come to the Bird Polar Research Center. And I could tell you about my research in Peru with the low latitudes, or you could hear about our polar explorations and a lot of data coming out from Ian Howard and his group and others that study the Arctic, including Aaron Wilson himself. But let's take a look at what the National Climate Assessment has looked at for the climate impacts and trends in the US and see where our region, again, is highlighted as being impacted through the hydrologic regime with excess moisture and flooding, extreme precipitation as salient features. But of course, with the same altered background state of the atmosphere, what we're seeing really is climate change is a threat multiplier, and its regional expression is variable. We know that out west, through drought and heat, we're seeing increased fires, okay, and rising temperatures. So we need to remember that there's changing characteristics regionally. And if we zoom in at what we've seen for the US and into our region, again, what we've noticed is a temperature shift with increased annual temperatures. And what these plots show is the differences in degrees Fahrenheit, okay? But notice that while most of the land surfaces on this planet are warming up, and that paleoclimate records suggest we're warmer than we have been in millennia, the seasonal differences are telling us to the nature of the warming and its impact to us. So winter temperatures rising faster than summer, more widespread in the colder periods of the year. For precipitation, we're seeing a similar increase, overall about 4% annually since 1901. Ohio has actually seen a 5 to 15% increase, and that's the total. But if we break down by season, there's important differences. We see where the spring and fall in particular are showing much more intensity growths of precipitation. This is relevant, again, to Ohio's impact to our ag sector and others, to our transport. So if we look at our long-term precipitation trends to bring home the point that what we're seeing lately is an increase in precip, but also critically that this precip is falling in more intense events. You could quantify this and show how in recent decades, these are 5-year periods, how the number of events with precip greater than 2 inches is rising. But it's important to remember that even in the past, over the 20th century, when we had anomalously intense years of increased intensity precip, those were big years for floods. I mentioned 1913 already, but if you want to see a direct impact, consider where boats are being used, where cars or pedestrians used to walk through these flood events, each one of which featured intense rainfall events that was unable to infiltrate and caused massive runout. So intensification of precip is a big signal, and there's lots of ways to just pick this climatologically. Some are less intuitive than others. But if you just look at the maps from the National Climate Assessment Report, and you notice the percent change for the 99th percentile rain, the total precip falling in the top 1% of days with precip, the region of the Northeast where Ohio is part of is a 42% increase. And the results are manifold and manifested here. We can see that saturation of conditions in fields or transport links are disruptive. We also see downstream effects as fields that are flooded and then running off leach lots of nutrients. And this is the root cause of a lot of our algal blooms that we've seen in Lake Erie and other waterways. This is a photo that I took off the internet from the New York Times, where a flood in Ohio got to the national level attention because of a 3-inch deluge, which happened to happen just as my kids and I went on our annual spring break backpacking trip. And I put this photo on the right, which is Burr Oak State Park, on my backdrop, so you can see behind me that this is the flooding reality of a 3-inch rainfall. What does the future hold? Well, those model outputs that are summarized in the National Climate Assessment Report suggest that we're in for warmer and, again, wetter conditions. This shows output put together by the GLISA, Great Lakes Integrated Science and Assessment Team, to show that for high emission scenarios, kind of continued business as usual in a way, for the mid-century 2040 to 2070, we're looking at temperatures increasing 4 to 4.5 degrees, precipitation differences increasing by 3 to 4 inches. And if we look at how this plays out temperature-wise, we can count up the number of days that are warmer than 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and notice that for future emission scenarios, roughly categorized as the lower emissions, if we're really good at curbing emissions, or the higher emission scenarios, we're going to see changes in the number of days with temperatures above 90 degrees by the middle of this century, increasing in number by 20 to 60 days. And right now, just for reference, between 1976 and 2005, we had 20 to 40 days. So that's more than doubling our incidence of really hot days. Think of the impact and who can get away from that heat and access to cooling. Lower emission scenarios, higher emission scenarios, again, depicting the hydrologic end of this spectrum. Well, actually, no, this is the minimum temperature. So these are days that are below freezing, and we're losing those. These are negative numbers. We're having projections of 20 to 30 days less of freezing overnight. And that has implications for all sorts of things that grow, good and bad. For lower emissions and higher emissions, precip shows big blotches of blue in this photo. These are, again, changes in percentages of annual days, numbers of days, again, with intense precip, so greater than 2 inches per day. And you can see these increasing quite a bit through Ohio. In reference, from 1976 to 2005, we're looking at less than a day. So these are large changes in our hydrologic regime that are feedbacks in our temperature changes. And if we look seasonally about how the models are projecting the distribution of our precip, again, we see a preference for wetter fall and spring, but even hints of drying out in the summer. So increasing these contrasts that we got a hint of last year, which are causing all sorts of problems for growing conditions, getting in the field to work. So could this be the new normal backdrop of climate? Because remember, climate's what's happening and shifting over longer periods, but it provides the backdrop for the everyday experience of weather. Longer growing seasons, potentially, warmer nights and winters, higher humidities, more rainfall, falling in more intense concentrated events, with perhaps increased autumn precip. And then when we picture what this might look like, there's lots of ways to do this, but this is one that's been famous and a lot of people have seen this, I think. where Ohio might be moving in the summer and winter would be analogous to Arkansas in the summer or Virginia to the North Carolinas in the winter. Okay, perhaps, but if we translate that to hardiness, growth, and changes in growing conditions, this phenology impact means crops and our beloved Buckeye tree might be moving north to that state up north that begins with M. And I can't even say it on this webinar, but you know what I'm talking about. What do we do about this? Well, there's lots of ways to think about adaptation. We are seeing climate change, it's underway. We're experiencing the effects. We are the cause. The scientific evidence is overwhelming, which means that we can do something about it. And there's lots of ways to step through processes to gain resilience. And this is kind of an outline of approach to look at adaptation planning, which is an important step that we've been part of as the State Climate Office, Jason and Aaron in particular. Often you have maybe heard this yourself, that the options before us really are to mitigate the problem, adapt to it, or suffer. And likely, really what we're seeing is all three. And so this is why in our webinar, we're emphasizing not only what we do about it, but who gets impacted, okay? The climate justice aspect of this. Who's able to adapt or not. And with that, I'll end and leave the contact information for my colleague, Dr. Wilson, with some backdrops of, again, a wetter Ohio. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Bryan. So up next, we have Mark. Mark, whenever you're ready, you're welcome to screen share and enjoy this next presentation.
Get going if I can push the right button. Yeah, thank you. So I want to talk specifically about the challenge within Ohio. And I will focus on across the board, but with a fairly heavy emphasis on electricity because of its importance to the state. As was suggested in the opening video, the problem and the challenge that we face here in Ohio is environmental, it's economic, and I think as you'll see as we go through this, it becomes political. And that's where you can come in on all three levels. Let's think about the Ohio economy and what are our leading economic sectors? We still have a large automotive sector, everything from assembly to foundry to parts. We have a large metals and chemical sector that makes all kinds of chemicals, especially along the Ohio River, does all kinds of metal work, everything from basic steel to aluminum to bending and shaping into many different parts for the auto industry as well as others. We have a significant agricultural sector, and that sector, interestingly, in Ohio has a very high concentration of both farming and food processing. And that is to some degree driven by the fact that our farms are close to metropolitan areas. And so a lot of the farming product that stays in state gets processed in state and then sold in state. We have what used to be called the white goods industry, appliances. Of course, now they come in all kinds of colors, but they held on to the name from back when stoves and refrigerators were all white. Whirlpool, Amana, and Maytag are all made in Clyde, Ohio, a huge factory. They're all made in the same plant, even though they carry three different brands, but they employ thousands of people, and the parts and pieces of those appliances are made in Ohio and shipped into the plant. We have an extensive aerospace and energy technology sector, ranging from down around Dayton and Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where all fuels that the military uses begin their certification process, to the NASA Glenn Research Labs up on Lake Erie, to many companies that make, we have GE Aviation down in Southwest Ohio. So we have a lot of work in those sectors. And again, we make a lot of finished product, but Ohio mostly makes parts and component pieces of those technologies. We have a huge logistics industry, and it's driven by this fact that 60% of the US and Canadian population is within 600 miles of Ohio. So that means it's an overnight drive for a truck. We have a lot of truck, we have a lot of rail, we have a lot of shipping, and we have a lot of air traffic. Moving products that we make out to the market, moving the parts that we need into our market to feed our industries. And a significant portion of all manufactured products in the United States cross Ohio at one point or another in the production cycle. And lately, we've really increased the size of our healthcare and financial services, particularly in our large cities, and that combines to some extent with large universities. What do all those have in common? The one thing they have in common is they are all incredibly energy intensive, and they are heavily fossil fuel use intensive, and they rely upon electricity and direct fossil fuel use to do all that work. One of the things that means is that we're the 9th largest generator of electricity in the United States, but we're the 4th largest consumer. We're 15th largest coal producer, but we're the 3rd largest coal consumer. And 90% of that coal is consumed in power plants. Even with the number of coal plants that have gone offline, we still rank number 3, and almost all that coal goes into the production of electricity. We've moved up in gas production, particularly with the shale gas change in the industry. Eastern Ohio, southeastern Ohio is home to 2 geological formations, the Utica Formation and the Marcellus Formation, that have produced an enormous amount of natural gas as the technology of hydraulic fracturing moves forward. And we've produced that gas with a little bit of careless attention to the methane leakage from those wells and those production facilities. And as you all know, methane is one of the most severe greenhouse gases. Despite our label as a Rust Belt state, the reality is we are still the 4th largest state in terms of manufacturing GDP. We're number 3 in total number of jobs in the state in manufacturing, and number 7 if you look at the percentage those jobs are of our workforce. Just to give you a sense of how much electricity we use, if Ohio were its own country, there are only 24 countries in the world that use more electricity on an annual basis than we do here in Ohio. There's a little over 200 countries and states globally. Only 24 of them use more electricity every year than we do in Ohio. That contributes to our economy. It has built all those industrial sectors that I talked about, as well as fossil fuel use for transportation, but it also has exacted a price. We rank 6th highest in carbon dioxide emissions in the United States. We're the 3rd highest in sulfur dioxide, and we're the 6th highest in nitrogen oxides. And I think what's really important to stress here is that we still rank that high, and our emissions are still that high, despite all the progress that's been made due to federal regulation over the past 20 years to control those emissions. We still put an enormous amount into the atmosphere. This gives you a look at where the shale gas is coming from. These are shale gas operations, almost all horizontal hydraulic fracturing wells, centered, interestingly enough, in mostly the same counties where the coal industry historically had been centered. It's an extract resource economy, and unfortunately, much like a large part of the third world, we suffer in that part of the state from the resource curse. The wealth of those resources is extracted and then it is shipped away. Right now, we see some of the changes of that, both in coal and shale gas. In coal, we've seen lots of mines shut down. The number of people employed has gone down to fewer than 2,000 statewide, which is very low historically. Our coal production is down. And there's a brief period of a boom that's created by shale gas. But what we're seeing now in the shale gas industry is that the jobs that come with that come in the exploration and digging the wells. Once the wells are in place and producing, there are actually very few jobs connected to them. And we're beginning to see Western Pennsylvania and Southeast Ohio see the shale gas economy collapse as all those rigs and drill teams leave and go somewhere else. In addition to the fact that shale gas now is extremely cheap, and so there's actually beginning to be a reduction in the production of the gas because it doesn't pay, and horizontal wells are more expensive to run than vertical wells. What's it done to our electricity? This is where we get our electricity today. 47% from coal, 34% from natural gas. The thing to remember about this pie chart is that as recently as 2008, almost 90% of our electricity came from coal, natural gas supplied in the single digits. That's a huge shift in how we generate electricity, but we've shifted from one fossil fuel to another fossil fuel. The economy has challenged the coal industry. Natural gas is picking up the slack. Nuclear has stayed in the 10 to 15% range for years. We have 2 nuclear plants in Ohio. They were both owned by First Energy, which has now come out of bankruptcy with a new name, Energy Harbors, but it's the 2 nuclear plants on Lake Erie. The state has tried to address this issue. In 2008, because we were re-regulating the electric utility industry, there was a bill passed that re-regulated it, but also introduced for the first time ever in Ohio, a renewable portfolio standard, and as importantly, an aggressive energy efficiency standard. That passed with a Democratic governor and a legislature in which both chambers were controlled overwhelmingly by Republicans. It passed with only 1 negative vote. The fossil fuel industry, frankly, did not like that. They were not happy with that, and a number of our investor-owned utilities were not like that. And so as you look through these dates, what you notice is that about every 2 years, there's some kind of an attack on those portfolio standards. In 2012, 2 years after the portfolio became effective, we saw a regulatory regime introduced for the explosion of the shale gas industry. And as long as the legislature was at it, they tinkered with the definitions of both efficiency and renewables to add more things to them, many of which didn't really achieve efficiency and certainly weren't renewable, but would count toward meeting the portfolio standards. In 2014, the original portfolio had demanded that half of the renewable energy come from in-state production. 2014, the legislature eliminated that. It put a freeze for 2 years on the standards, and it changed the wind setback. Wind setback is how far back commercial turbines have to be safe. They were measured about 1,300 feet from an inhabited structure. The legislature changed it to 1,300 feet from a property line, and by doing so, they made 90% of northwestern Ohio, where the wind is best, ineligible for commercial turbines. 2016, they tried to extend the freeze. 2017 and 18, they tried to get rid of it. Culminated in 2019 by ending the renewable and efficiency standards and providing bailouts for the 2 bankrupt nuclear plants and 2 coal plants, one in Indiana and one in Ohio. So we see with the changes at the federal level and at the state level, everything's going in the wrong direction. So should we give up? No, we shouldn't, because other people are picking up the challenge. This is the world headquarters of Owens Corning, which is in Toledo. That's their employee parking lot. They decided to put a solar array over it, improve the parking, and it gets a lot of electricity for the world headquarters building. This is a company in Southwest Ohio, Malink. Malink makes energy efficiency range hoods for restaurants and commercial cooking operations. They decided to extend that focus on efficiency and really drill down on making their facility a zero emission facility, which they've done. It's happening all over the state. Cities are adopting 100% renewable goals. Minster, a tiny village in Western Ohio, has the largest municipally owned solar plus energy storage project. JP Morgan Chase is about to install the second largest commercial office solar system in the world here in Columbus. IKEA has put, this is their Columbus store, but they've put solar arrays like that on every roof of every store. So the leadership has shifted to the local level, to corporations and large users, and to educational institutions. What does that mean for us? It means that we can have more direct and immediate impact on the decisions. 2020 is obviously a presidential election, but we're also electing all of the United States House of Representatives. We're electing all of the Ohio House of Representatives and about half of the Ohio Senate. Before you vote for them, ask them to vote for you by finding out where they stand on climate change and how to solve it. Take a look at your own institutions, your own homes. Are you doing what you can for energy efficiency? Are your institutions buying renewable energy? Ohio State buys a significant part of its electricity from a wind farm that was put in before the rules changed in Northwest Ohio. So not only are you getting renewable energy, you're creating jobs and investment in the state. I think one of the big questions that challenges us is how we emerge from the pandemic. I think there's a real possibility that we will not do things the same way when we come out. There'll be an enormous federal stimulus package. Will that spend its money on things that help climate change be mitigated and solved? That's a question we have to ask our elected officials and demand that they ask of their programs, that's where they put their money, and that they begin to act on our behalf to fight climate change. We can make that happen. And finally, and not to be ignored, we heard this in the opening video, poorer communities, communities of color are always more at risk from the impacts of these policies. One of the things we have to consider is how those groups will benefit from any attempts to fight climate change. Will they have simple things like access to renewable energy? Will they have access to clean water? And how do we build the programs that do that as well? And with that, I will stop and give it back to Karina.
Wow, thank you so much, Mark. That was awesome. So without further ado, I'm going to quickly pass it on to Anne from Freshwater Future. Anne, if you'd like to share your screen, we'll go on to our third presentation before jumping into the breakout room.
I'm working on that here.
Mark might have to unshare his screen first.
There we go.
Did that get me out, Jason?
Yeah, Mark, I turned off your screen.
Okay, great, thank you.
Okay, I think we're here. Is that correct?
Just pull up the PowerPoint.
Oh, I do have that. Let me see.
Still have your video.
Oops, escape. Just a second. Share. Here we go. It should be there now.
Aha, it worked.
It's a little slow. I apologize for that.
No worries.
All right, sounds good. Let's make sure you're seeing the right thing though here, so I can see it with you.
Yep,
you can see it.
You have to minimize your Zoom screen.
Trying to. There we go. Is that better?
Nope, you have to escape out of that screen.
Okay.
Yep, and just minimize that one. And then if you go to full screen on your PowerPoint, it should be there.
Okay, that's what I had originally, but then I couldn't see you. Present. There we go.
Great.
Are you seeing it?
Yep.
Excellent. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for the slight delay there. Appreciate it. So my name's Ann Baughman, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. My coworker, Alicia Smith, was going to be here, and so I'm going to do my best to fill in for her. I think we learned a lot by listening to both Bryan and Mark. I mean, Bryan shared what the future might look like for Ohio, and we heard from Mark about all the great opportunities that we have to try to make a difference through renewable energies and how we can reduce our carbon footprint and what those opportunities might be in the future. What I'd like to do, though, is next kind of take off from where Mark left off, which is talking about how do we engage our communities that are the most vulnerable to climate change? What can we do to make sure that they're going to be climate resilient and what that means? So I'd like to talk a little bit about how some of our communities are being impacted right now, today. We'll talk a little bit more about what makes those communities resilient and what it will take. I'll talk a little bit about environmental justice and the principles that we work from, and hope to engage you in those as well, and then some of the solutions. Okay. So in Toledo, many of you know that there was a harmful algal bloom in 2014 that shut off the water for 4 days. This was an example of what can happen when our communities, and it wasn't just the poor communities that were left out, but my coworker Alicia woke up one morning and she found out that her water was not safe to drink. Not only was the water not safe to drink, it also wasn't safe to touch. And so she immediately got her neighbors together, her family together, and they started knocking on doors in the neighborhood, making sure that people knew that they could not drink or touch the water, that they couldn't make coffee that morning. And then they soon found out that there wasn't access to bottled water nearby. Their grocery stores and convenience stores had sold out. They had to drive hours away in order to get water. So this was a wake-up call for Alicia and for her family. In the upper corner, there's flooding, as Bryan was talking about. You know, these extreme rain events are becoming much more common and much more frequent in our communities across the Great Lakes region, where in 24 hours we get dumped with 3 or more inches of rain, which causes flooding of people's basements. It causes potentially then mold afterward, which can be a health problem. And in addition, it can cause a lot of property damage, whether you own your property or it's rental. There's also our industries, and Mark was talking quite a bit about some of the industries in Ohio and how important they are. But yet these industries can also create a lot of air pollution. And quite often the communities that are living close to these facilities are our most vulnerable. They're the low-income communities, they're our communities of color, they are our immigrant communities, the people with access to less resources. This is a picture of Detroit, but there's similar places in Ohio as well. Even actually in Detroit, the University of Michigan School of Public Health determined that air pollution kills 650 residents a year. That's more than twice than who are killed in violence in a year. And so we know that these are problems, and climate change can make all of these problems worse, particularly they can exacerbate them from a public health point of view. So I want to talk a little bit about this equation up here, and it's vulnerability is equal to exposure S is sensitivity or susceptibility, and it's subtracted by your adaptive capacity. And I bring this up because this is what's really important, not just for our resources, but for our communities. And when we look at our at-risk communities, we can start to understand what makes them more vulnerable. One of that first things is exposure. Our vulnerable communities are exposed. They might be located, their houses are closer to those industries. They are often in the urban environment where they do not have adequate trees. They might not have adequate green space. So there isn't much cooling for those heat waves that we get in the summertime. There's also a lack of places for people to gather potentially in a safe place. Uh, some of these communities also have an increased exposure from their housing is of poor quality. They don't have great insulation so that their homes are hot in the summertime, they're colder in the winter. They might be more vulnerable to floods. They might not have access to sump pumps to pump out the water that comes in during a flood. So they have a more risk at being exposed to some of these extremes, the higher heat, the rain, potentially the cold. So then when we look at the susceptibility or sensitivity, this is really about public health when we're talking about our communities. In our low risk, our high risk or communities, they may not have good access to public health, to healthcare. They don't often have access to information about healthcare. They may not have access to good quality food, produce, a grocery store that was in walking distance. In addition, as I already mentioned, these areas also have a higher rate of asthma. They may have a higher rate of diabetes and other health problems as well. So when you combine that exposure with that sensitivity, we already see that they're more vulnerable than some of our other parts of our societies and community. And then we look at the adaptive capacity. So what is their ability to change or deal with some of these kind of events that might happen? So if you are getting, a week of very hot weather in the summer, what is their ability to find access to a place with a working air conditioner, perhaps some water that they can cool off? Perhaps their water isn't even safe to drink. So we know that in our low income communities that they don't have the ability to, their adaptive capacity isn't as strong as it could be. They don't have access to resources or decision makers like they should. So when we take all of that into account, we know that those are the areas where we really do need to focus on helping them to build their resilience. And to build resilience is that ability to overcome problems and barriers. And what we really want to do is really help uh, communities be able to uh, reduce their exposure problems, reduce their sensitivity, and then also increase their adaptive capacity so that they can deal with it. Now, if Alicia was here, she lives in Toledo and she is a member of the Junction neighborhood. She organized and was a founder of Junction Coalition, and she would have been able to talk to you as a community member as well. And I can't do that. I have to be honest. I live in a different place, so I am not a member of the community. But at Freshwater Future, we really do work with community. That is our mission, and that is the partnerships we form. And to do that work, we have adopted a set of environmental justice principles because these communities that we work with have for decades and centuries been discriminated against in a way that they are being harmed by not just the changes from climate, but as we talked about with that increased vulnerability. So I just want to highlight the 12 principles. I'll go through them kind of quickly, but also want to share with you later, if you would like, the document that we use. It's based on several different documents. But the work that we do is always community centered. That means we don't lead it. It's led by the community members. They make the decision of what needs to be done, and we support that work wherever possible. Respect, that's pretty straightforward. We always act with respect. Uh, this is a really important one, self-reflection and cultural humility. My solutions and what I think might work aren't always going to be the most appropriate when I'm working in a different community. That community, that idea might not be a good one. So I really need to be humble, and I need to listen, and I need to make sure that what I do is supportive of what's happening in the community. We form authentic relationships. We honor community timeframes. I think this is an important one when it comes to climate work in particular. Uh, it may take a little longer than what we think it's going to take because it may be that there's more people that need to get involved. There might be a longer process that's needed. And we have to change our approaches to make sure that they reflect what the community values are. We help them build on their strengths. There's always co-learning and ownership. It's important to not take credit for things that are not our own. We always foster continual dialogue. That's the only way we're going to solve long-term problems such as climate. Always working with transparency and accountability. Always working with integrity. Always working with community relevance. Making sure that what we do recognizes the history of that community and what's important to them. And last but definitely not least, really looking at equity and inclusion. That means making sure that you're getting all aspects of the community and not just some of them. So what I wanted to do next was kind of transition to what does climate resilience really look like, and what are some of those solutions that help to address some of these issues of environmental justice, and also help to, decrease exposure, decrease sensitivity, increase adaptive capacity so that we're actually decreasing overall vulnerability. And there's, I could talk for days, and there's other people who could talk for days about the examples that exist, many of these in Ohio. And since we only have a few minutes, I'm going to do my best to just highlight a few of them, and hopefully it will inspire some ideas for you later in the discussion groups. But this is my friend Val Scott. She's in the middle of this picture. She's a Cleveland resident. Val's way to address this is through both mitigation and adaptation, and I'll talk a little bit about the differences of those. I know it's been mentioned both by Bryan and Mark, but Val works to grow healthy food, and then she shares that healthy food. But not only does she share the healthy food, she teaches people how to cook produce. She helps them how to cook meals for their family so that they get excited about cooking. And she does it in a space where she shares the food with the community so that it starts to strengthen social ties within her neighborhood. So people get to know one another, and they start to take care of each other so that they have stronger connections, so that when problems might arise from a flooding event or a heat wave, they'll be prepared to help each other out. In addition to that, Val has what she calls her garden, the Purple Oasis. She's planted a number of different fruit trees. And those fruit trees are part of mitigation. They're helping to provide a garden that provides some shade and a cool spot. She has picnic tables, places for people to hang out, so that it helps to provide a place that will not only provide cooling, but it will also help to absorb some of the heat in the summer and some of the rain from those extreme rain events. These are just a few pictures of some of the people that we work with, and I just want to share a few other ideas of some of the solutions that are so important. Some of the solutions that we see at the community level that are critical, they might involve planting rain gardens, installing stormwater, green infrastructure projects, rain barrels. Some of these can help to absorb some of the water to reduce some of the flooding risks. It might be that you're taking over a vacant lot and you're planting trees. You're also providing a place for people to gather and connecting those ties. It might be that you're spending time really making homes more energy efficient that are within your neighborhood. That's one of the lowest hanging fruits we can do, is to make our homes cooler in the summer and warmer in the winter, so we reduce the amount of energy we need to use. It might be that that's creating emergency plans so that when there are emergencies, or that people can get together and know what to do. It might be what Bryan mentioned, engaging the community in citizen science, collecting images of flooding or collecting rainfall information, or identifying other things that can be helpful. In addition, the last one is really providing people a seat at the table. It's really important for our communities to be a part of the decision making, because that is how we'll make sure that our policies moving forward will include the solutions that they need to reduce their vulnerability. And then finally, I just want to share this beautiful mural that was done by the Junction Coalition, and Alicia, of course, would have shared this. You know, after the harmful algal blooms in Toledo, the Junction Coalition formed, and they really engaged the community in finding solutions, but they also engaged the youth in creating art and music. There's a spoken word piece that goes with this that I will share with Karina so that she can share with all of you later. And they really started the community to revere the water and how important it was for them, and that they knew they couldn't take it for granted anymore, and that they wouldn't, and they would work to try to prevent this from happening again. So they created this beautiful mural to remind them of their strength and to continue that work.
All right, thank you so much, Anne. So at this point, I would like to open it up for Q&A. So if anybody has questions, you are able to ask them by raising your hand. So again, if you go to the participants section on the bottom bar on your screen and select that, there will be an option to raise your hand on the left-hand side. So if anybody has questions, feel free to ask them. I see Mark Anthony, you have a question. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Sure can.
Oh, excellent. So thank you to the three speakers today. I just have a question in terms of if you've come across populations that have resisted the climate change rhetoric, or how you have gone about you know, dialoguing with them to help them understand what's actually happening in their neighborhoods.
So this is Anne. Do you want me to jump in?
Sure.
Okay. I think it's a great question, Mark. I think the important thing, and this is maybe partially in some of those principles, is the first place is really listening and learning where community's at. And so, you know, starting there is really the first place. And what I have found is once you understand what their concerns are, you can help them see how the climate lens, some of the things that are coming down the pike and are happening today might make some of their problems worse. And so they're usually very quick to start to want to engage in that conversation.
Yeah, this is Mark. I'll jump in with a slightly different one, which is you think about where the gas industry is and where the coal industry is. You get real pushback on solving the issue of climate change because people see it accurately as a direct threat to their livelihoods. So major national environmental organization led a campaign, still does, to close coal plants. Well, coal-fired generators in the communities where they are tend to have the best jobs, the highest skilled jobs, the best paying jobs, and are an enormous part of the tax base. So it's really incumbent upon us to not just say what we oppose, but to figure out what it is that would take its place. And how do we go into a community and resolve the legitimate fears they have about economic devastation that the industry has very effectively tied to environmental controls.
Thank you so much. I see a question here from Kurt Speed. Kurt, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Sure can.
Great, thank you. So from what I've learned, oftentimes with cultural change, one of the keys is teaching the younger community, you know, in their education and everything. And I was just wondering, is there any movement to get some of this curriculum into the local public schools? Because with my school, there was almost none of that. And yeah, I was just wondering, is there any like political movement, or is there anything that can be done in getting this to people in their growing up years?
And would any of our speakers want to jump in on this?
Well, I'm not sure how organized the effort to do it is. The attempts that I know about have been very localized. And interestingly, the leaders in that have been schools that have gone ahead and put either wind or solar energy on their campuses, on their rooftops, and then blended those into the curricula, even at the elementary school level. And that gets kids to start to think about energy in a very different way. I think you've hit on a really critical issue. I think it has to be done at the local school district level to be effective.
And that's allowed?
Oh, sure, it's allowed. I mean, the question is, will there be interest in the community that would oppose it? And that's where you also have to do some community education to go along with it.
So I'm Jason Cervenek. I'm the outreach coordinator for the Bird Center, and so we do a lot of this at the Bird Center, trying to educate the wider public. There's national surveying data, and there's widespread support for teaching this within schools because we know that's where most youth will encounter it. It also includes beyond just the science classroom. There's a lot of opportunities to talk in the history and English language arts classroom about how you build an argument with reasoning. And I know a lot of our work is trying to think of beyond the science classroom, how do you engage people in a conversation? Because a lot of the disinformation campaigns we've seen with how you vet fact and fiction are relevant to other subjects outside of science. And in the past, we know with other environmental problems, there's been these disinformation campaigns, as Mark spoke to, because they're a vested interests. And that was true of lead in gasoline and paints. That was true with cigarette smoking. That was true with sulfur dioxide, and now it's true with climate change. And if we don't, in a robust way, teach youth how to be savvy with literacy and be savvy with content, there will be something else down the road that'll be just like this. And I think the pandemic we're in is a great example of how we see disinformation campaigns and how dangerous they can be.
Thank you. All right, going down the question lines here, I see a Forrest Wakey. I'm sorry if I butcher your last name. Forrest, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yes, you can.
Thank you. This is a question for Mark. So you were talking about kind of trouble we've had with fossil fuel companies in legislature.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering what kind of the future looks like for renewable energies and for wind or otherwise for the state of Ohio.
Well, I think it's challenging at the state legislature. I think what you begin to see is that local officials, whether that be township or county commissioners or big city mayors, can begin to have an impact because they're moving on the issue. The legislature has to be challenged to justify the impact of the policies they've adopted, not just environmentally, but economically. Wind is an example of where this has not been effectively done yet. But when they changed that setback requirement for wind in Western Ohio, there was $6 billion of investment in wind farm construction ready to go that stopped and then walked away because they couldn't build the farm. There's an organizing challenge here in terms of public perception. The issue is that if you look at polling, acting on climate change and accepting it as our responsibility is popular among people. People agree with that. What they don't do is make it an issue that they use to cast their vote. And that's where we have to focus the change.
Right. Thank you.
Okay, on to the next question. I see the name is Rue LM. Rue, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you.
Thank you, Karina. This is a very interesting dialogue, and I thank you all for this. I'm here as an educator. And before I get to my question, I would just say I really appreciate this, and I hope we can have more cross-disciplinary exchanges like this on this issue.
Thanks for being here.
No, thank you. So my question is a bit confounded in a variety of ways, and give me some time to distill it. I know you three are from the environmental side of things, but I'm a scientist slash engineer who is just here as I guess a concerned earthling. And one thing we talk about in our class is just how impactful the individual can be, because we essentially serve as the bottleneck to quite an array of these issues as consumers. But one question kind of touched on the education aspect, but since we kind of have just moderators as environmentalists, the question I have is how engaged are we with industry to kind of help pinpointing how some of their activities are impacting the environment, and how can we help industry to kind of come up with tangible solutions to some of their practices?
Well, I'll jump in first on this. This is Mark. I certainly appreciate the views of concerned earthlings. So thank you for doing that. Look, I think the reality is that we're seeing changes in the business community. Some of it is driven by environmental concern, and some of it, which we heard in the opening video, is flat out economics. Renewable energy today is cheaper than fossil fuel energy, and it's cheaper than nuclear energy. And so I think there's a business argument you can make to those corporations. Owens Corning, they're best known for their insulation, Pink Panther insulation. So they've been conscious about efficiency for a long time, but they're not just doing that huge solar array over the parking lot because they care about the environment, which they do. They also care about their bottom line, and locking in cheaper electricity for their world headquarters for the foreseeable future was an important part of the decision that they made. So I think you're absolutely right. We have to engage folks. Energy efficiency is another issue. Big corporations, big facilities have entire staffs focused on energy efficiency. Smaller businesses don't have that expertise, and they could use that expertise from somebody with an engineering background. And They need the help. They know they should be more energy efficient, but frankly, they focus on keeping the doors open, particularly right now. And they can get help from the community figuring out how to be better stewards of energy use and the environment. I think they'd be open to it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, and this is going to be our last question. Anna Willow, you have your hand raised. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you.
Yeah, hi, thank you.
Thank you.
So my question is coming from the perspective of local community groups. So recognizing the necessity of environmental justice and of involving all people if we're going to move forward, what advice do you have for local groups, in my case, in a predominantly white and relatively affluent area, for engaging unrepresented populations in an authentic and durable way? This has been a struggle for us, working on real local grassroots climate resilience action in Delaware, Ohio, and I'd love to hear any advice.
And do you want to step forward? Oh, you got it.
Yeah, I'm more than willing to jump in and take a guess, but also happy to talk to Anna in person afterwards if she would like to. Feel free to contact me. I think the first thing is probably finding one of the two or 2 to 3 of the key leaders in the community that are respected, that you can try to build a relationship with. So it might not be about climate right away. It might be just about getting to know one another and understanding some of their other issues that they're dealing with. So I think I would start there of just figuring out who are the key people that are respected and seeing if you can ask them to coffee, ask them to someplace where they're comfortable meeting and starting a conversation there.
Thanks.
And thank you all for asking such wonderful questions. Thank you, Bryan, Ann, and Mark for all answering these questions, and Jason as well for stepping in. So at this point, we're going to kind of segue into the discussion portion. So I'm going to stop recording. And thank you all for watching the webinar if you're not tuned in live.